Chapter 13 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Storm. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox Jr. Chapter 13. Hale rode that night under a brilliant moon to the worm of a railroad that had been creeping for many years toward the Gap. The head of it was just protruding from the natural tunnel 20 miles away. There he sent his horse back, slept in a shanty till morning, and then the train crawled through a towering bench of rock. The mouth of it on the other side opened into a mighty amphitheater with solid rock walls shooting vertically hundreds of feet upward. Vertically, he thought, with the back of his head between his shoulders as he looked up. They were more than vertical, they were actually concave. The Almighty had not only stored riches immeasurable in the hills behind him, he had driven this passage himself to help puny men to reach them, and yet the wretched road was going toward them like a snail. On the 5th night thereafter he was back there at the tunnel again from New York, with a grim mouth and a happy eye. He had brought success with him this time, and there was no sleep for him that night. He had been delayed by a wreck, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and not a horse was available, so he started those 20 miles afoot, and day was breaking when he looked down on the little valley shrouded in mist and just wakening from sleep. Things had been moving while he was away, as he quickly learned. The English were buying lands right and left at the Gap 60 miles southwest. 2 companies had purchased most of the town site where he was, his town site, and were going to pool their holdings and form an improvement company. But a good deal was left, and straightway Hale got a map from his office and with it in his hand walked down the curve of the river and over Poplar Hill and beyond. Early breakfast was ready when he got back to the hotel. He swallowed a cup of coffee so hastily that it burned him. And June, when she passed his window on her way to school, saw him busy over his desk. She started to shout to him, but he looked so haggard and grim that she was afraid and went on, vaguely hurt by a preoccupation that seemed quite to have excluded her. For 2 hours then Hale haggled and bargained, and at 10 o'clock he went to the telegraph office. The operator, who was speculating in a small way himself, smiled when he read the telegram. "1,000 an acre," he repeated with a whistle. "You could have got that at 25 per 3 months ago." "I know," said Hale. "There's time enough yet." Then he went to his room, pulled the blinds down and went to sleep, while rumour played with his name through the town. It was nearly the closing hour of school when, dressed and freshly shaven, he stepped out into the pale afternoon and walked up toward the schoolhouse. The children were pouring out of the doors. At the gate there was a sudden commotion. He saw a crimson figure flash into the group that had stopped there and flash out, and then June came swiftly toward him, followed closely by a tall boy with a cap on his head. That far away he could see that she was angry, and he hurried toward her. Her face was white with rage, her mouth was tight and her dark eyes were aflame. Then from the group another tall boy darted out, and behind him ran a smaller one, bellowing. Hale heard the boy with the cap call kindly, "Hold on, little girl, I won't let them touch you." June stopped with him, and Hale ran to them. "Here," he called, "what's the matter?" June burst into crying when she saw him and leaned over the fence sobbing. The tall lad with the cap had his back to Hale, and he waited till the other 2 boys came up. Then he pointed to the smaller one and spoke to Hale without looking around. "Why, that little skate there was teasing this little girl, and—" "She slapped him," said Hale grimly. The lad with the cap turned, his eyes were dancing, and the shock of curly hair that stuck from his absurd little cap shook with his laughter. "Slapped him? She knocked him as flat as a pancake." "Yes, an' you said you'd stand fer her," said the other tall boy, who was plainly a mountain lad. He was near bursting with rage. "You bet I will," said the boy with the cap heartily. right now," and he dropped his books to the ground. "Hold on," said Hale, jumping between them. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," he said to the mountain boy. "I wasn't atter the gal," he said indignantly. "I was comin' fer him." The boy with the cap tried to get away from Hale's grasp. "No use, sir," he said coolly. "You'd better let us settle it now. We'll have to do it some time. I know the breed. He'll fight all right and there's no use putting it off. It's got to come." "You bet it's got to come," said the mountain lad. "You can't call my brother names." "Well, he is a skate," said the boy with the cap, with no heat at all in spite of his indignation, and Hale wondered at his aged calm. "Every one of you little tads," he went on coolly, waving his hand at the gathered group, "is a skate who teases this little girl, and you older boys are skates for letting the little ones do it, the whole pack of you, and I'm going to spank any little tadpole who does it hereafter, and I'm going to punch the head off any big one who allows it. It's got to stop NOW," and as Hale dragged him off he added to the mountain boy, "and I'm going to begin with you whenever you say the word." Hale was laughing now. "You don't seem to understand," he said. "This is my affair." "I beg pardon, sir, I don't understand." "Why, I'm taking care of this little girl." "Oh, well, you see I didn't know that. I've only been here 2 days. But," his frank, generous face broke into a winning smile, "you don't go to school. You'll let me watch out for her there?" "Sure, I'll be very grateful." "Not at all, sir, not at all. It was a great pleasure, and I think I'll have lots of fun." He looked at June, whose grateful eyes had hardly left his face. "So don't you soil your little fist any more with any of 'em, but just tell me, June," she said, and a shy smile came through her tears. "June," he finished, with a boyish laugh. "Good bye, sir. You haven't told me your name." "I suppose you know my brothers, sir, the Berkeleys." "I should say so," and Hale held out his hand. "You're Bob?" "Yes, sir." "I knew you were coming, and I'm mighty glad to see you. I hope you and June will be good friends, and I'll be very glad to have you watch over her when I am away." "I'd like nothing better, sir," he said cheerfully, and quite impersonally as far as June was concerned. Then his eyes lighted up. "My brothers don't seem to want me to join the police guard. Won't you say a word for me?" "I certainly will." "Thank you, sir." That "sir" no longer bothered Hale. At first he had thought it a mark of respect to his superior age, and he was not particularly pleased, but when he knew now that the lad was another son of the old gentleman who he saw riding up the valley every morning on a gray horse, with several dogs trailing after him, he knew the word was merely a family characteristic of old-fashioned courtesy. "Isn't he nice, June?" "Yes," she said. "Have you missed me, June?" June slid her hand into his. "I'm so glad you come back." They were approaching the gate now. "June, you said you weren't going to cry any more." June's head dropped. "I know, but I just can't help it when I get mad," she said seriously. "I'd bust if I didn't." "All right," said Hale kindly. "I've cried twice," she said. "What were you mad about the other time?" "I wasn't mad." "Then why did you cry, June?" Her dark eyes looked full at him a moment, and then her long lashes hid them. "'Cause you was so good to me." Hale choked suddenly and patted her on the shoulder. "Go in now, little girl, and study. Then you must take a walk. I've got some work to do. I'll see you at supper time." "All right," said June. She turned at the gate to watch Hale enter the hotel, and as she started indoors she heard a horse coming at a gallop, and she turned again to see her cousin, Dave Tolliver, pull up in front of the house. She ran back to the gate, and then she saw that he was swaying in his saddle. "Hello, June," he called thickly. Her face grew hard and she made no answer. "I've come over to take you back home." She only stared at him rebukingly, and he straightened in his saddle with an effort at self-control, but his eyes got darker and he looked ugly. "D'you hear me? I've come over to take you home." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," she said hotly, and she turned to go back into the house. "Oh, you ain't ready now? Well, git ready an' we'll start in the mornin'. I'll be around fer ye 'bout the break o' day." He whirled his horse with an oath. June was gone. She saw him ride swaying down the street, and she ran across to the hotel and found Hale sitting in the office with another man. Hale saw her entering the door swiftly. He knew something was wrong and he rose to meet her. "Dave's here," she whispered hurriedly, "and he says he's come to take me home." "Well," said Hale, "he won't do it, will he?" June shook her head, and then she said significantly, "Dave's drinkin'." Hale's brow clouded. Straightway he foresaw trouble, but he said cheerily, "All right, you go back and keep in the house, and I'll be over by and by and we'll talk it over." And without another word she went. She had meant to put on her new dress and her new shoes and stockings that night, that Hale might see her, but she was in doubt about doing it when she got to her room. She tried to study her lessons for the next day, but she couldn't fix her mind on them. She wondered if Dave might not get into a fight, or perhaps he would get so drunk that he would go to sleep somewhere. She knew that men did that after drinking very much, and anyhow he would not bother her until the next morning, and then he would be sober and would go quietly back home. She was so comforted that she got to thinking about the hair of the girl who sat in front of her at school. It was plaited and she had studied just how it was done, and she began to wonder whether she could fix her own that way. So she got in front of the mirror and loosened hers in a mass about her shoulders, the mass that was to Hale like the golden bronze of a wild turkey's wing. The other girl's plaits were the same size, so that the hair had to be equally divided, thus she argued to herself, but how did that girl manage to plait it behind her back? She did it in front, of course, so June divided the bronze heap behind her and pulled one half of it in front of her, and then for a moment she was helpless. Then she laughed. It must be done like the grass blades and strings she had plaited for Bub, of course, so dividing that half into 3 parts she did the plaiting swiftly and easily. When it was finished she looked at the braid much pleased, for it hung below her waist and was much longer than any of the other girls at school. The transition was easy now, so interested had she become. She got out her tan shoes and stockings and the pretty white dress and put them on. The mill pond was dark with shadows now, and she went down the stairs and out to the gate just as Dave again pulled up in front of it. He stared at the vision wonderingly and long, and then he began to laugh with the scorn of soberness and the silliness of drink. "You ain't June, are ye?" The girl never moved. As if by a preconcerted signal 3 men moved toward the boy, and one of them said sternly, "Drop that pistol. You are under arrest." The boy glared like a wild thing trapped. From one to another of the 3 a pistol gleamed in the hand of each, and slowly thrust his own weapon into his pocket. "Get off that horse," added the stern voice. Just then Hale rushed across the street, and the mountain youth saw him. "Catch his pistol!" cried June in terror for Hale, for she knew what was coming, and one of the men caught with both hands the wrist of Dave's arm as it shot behind him. "Take him to the calaboose." At that June opened the gate. That disgrace she could never stand, but Hale spoke. "I know him, boys. He doesn't mean any harm. He doesn't know the regulations yet. Suppose we let him go home." "All right," said Logan. "The calaboose or home. Will you go home?" In the moment the mountain boy had apparently forgotten his captors. He was staring at June with wonder, amazement, incredulity struggling through the fumes in his brain to his flushed face. She, a Tolliver, had warned a stranger against her own blood cousin. "Will you go home?" repeated Logan sternly. The boy looked around at the words as though he were half dazed, and his baffled face turned sick and white. "Lemme loose," he said sullenly. "I'll go home." And he rode silently away after giving Hale a vindictive look that told him plainer than words that more was yet to come. Hale had heard June's warning cry, but now when he looked for her she was gone. He went in to supper and sat down at the table, and still she did not come. "She's got a surprise for you," said Mrs. Crane, smiling mysteriously. "She's been fixing for you for an hour. My, but she's pretty in them new clothes. Why, June!" June was coming in. She wore her homespun, her scarlet homespun, and a Psyche knot. She did not seem to have heard Mrs. Crane's note of wonder, and she sat quietly down in her seat. Her face was pale, and she did not look at Hale. Nothing was said of Dave. In fact, June said nothing at all, and Hale, too, vaguely understanding, kept quiet. Only when he went out, Hale called her to the gate and put one hand on her head. "I'm sorry, little girl." The girl lifted her great troubled eyes to him, but no word passed her lips, and Hale helplessly left her. June did not cry that night. She sat by the window, wretched and tearless. She had taken sides with furriners, against her own people. That was why, instinctively, she had put on her old homespun, with the vague purpose of reparation to them. She knew the story Dave would take back home, the bitter anger that his people and hers would feel at the outrage done him, anger against the town, the guard, against Hale because he was a part of both, and even against her. Dave was merely drunk. He had simply shot off his pistol. That was no harm in the hills, and yet everybody had dashed toward him as though he had stolen something, even Hale. Yes, even that boy with the cap who had stood up for her at school that afternoon. He had rushed up, his face aflame with excitement, eager to take part should Dave resist. She had cried out impulsively to save Hale, but Dave would not understand. No, in his eyes she had been false to family and friends, to the clan. She had sided with furriners. What would her father say? Perhaps she'd better go home next day, perhaps for good, for there was a deep unrest within her that she could not fathom, a premonition that she was at the parting of the ways, a vague fear of the shadows that hung about the strange new path on which her feet were set. The old mill creaked in the moonlight below her. Sometimes, when the wind blew up Lonesome Cove, she could hear Uncle Billy's wheel creaking just that way. A sudden pang of homesickness choked her, but she did not cry. Yes, she would go home next day. She blew out the light and undressed in the dark, as she did at home, and went to bed. And that night the little nightgown lay apart from her in the drawer, unfolded and untouched. End of chapter 13.
Of the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Venditti, MikeVenditti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr., Chapter 14. But June did not go home. Hale anticipated that resolution of hers and forestalled it by being on hand for breakfast and taking June over to the porch of his little office. There he tried to explain to her that they were trying to build a town, and must have law and order, that they must have no personal feeling for or against anybody, and must treat everybody exactly alike. No other course was fair. And though June could not quite understand, she trusted him, and she said she would keep on at school until her father came for her. "Do you think he will come, June?" The little girl hesitated. "I'm afeared he will," she said, and Hale smiled. "Well, I'll try to persuade him to let you stay if he does come." June was quite right. She had seen the matter the night before just as it was, for just at that hour young Dave, sobered but still on the verge of tears from anger and humiliation, was telling the story of the day in her father's cabin. The old man's brows drew together and his eyes grew fierce and sullen, both at the insult to a Tolliver and at the thought of a certain moonshine still up a ravine not far away, and the indirect danger to it in any finicky growth of law and order. Still, he had a keen sense of justice, and he knew that Dave had not told all the story, and from him, Dave, to his wonder, got scant comfort. For another reason as well. With the deal pending for the sale of his lands, the shrewd old man would not risk giving offense to Hale, not until that matter was settled, anyway, and so June was safer from interference just then than she knew. But Dave carried the story far and wide, and it spread as the story can only in the hills, so that the two people most talked about among the Tollivers, and through Loretta among the Falins as well, were June and Hale, and at the Gap similar talk would come. Already Hale's name was on every tongue in the town, and there, because of his recent purchase of town-site land, he was already, aside from his personal influence, a man of mysterious power. Meanwhile, the persistent shadow of the coming boom had stolen over the hills, and the work of the guard had grown rapidly. Every Saturday there had been local lawlessness to deal with. The spirit of personal liberty that characterized the spot was traditional. Here for half a century the people of Wise County, and of Lee, whose border was but a few miles down the river, came to get their wool carted, their grist ground, and farming utensils mended. Here, too, elections were held viva voce. Under the beeches at the foot of the wooded spur now known as Imboden Hill, here were the muster days of wartime. Here on Saturdays the people had come together during half a century for sport and horse trading, and to talk politics. Here they drank applejack and hard cider, chafed and quarreled and fought fist and skull. Here the bullies of the two counties would come together to decide who was the best man. Here was naturally engendered the hostility between the hill dwellers of Wise and the valley people of Lee, and here was fought a famous battle between a famous bully of Wise and a famous bully of Lee. On election days the country people would bring in ginger cakes made of corn molasses, bread homemade of burr flour, and moonshine and applejack, which the candidates would buy and distribute through the crowd. And always during the afternoon there were men who would try to prove themselves the best Democrats in the state of Virginia by resort to tooth, fist, and eye-gouging thumb. Then to these elections sometimes would come the Kentuckians from over the border to stir up the hostility between state and state, which makes that border bristle with enmity to this day. For half a century, then, all wild oats from elsewhere usually sprouted at the Gap, and thus the Gap had been the shrine of personal freedom, the place where any one individual had the right to do his pleasure with bottle and cards and politics, and any other the right to prove him wrong if he were strong enough. Very soon, as the Honorable Sam Budd predicted, they had the hostility of Lee concentrated on them as siding with the county of Wise, and they would gain in addition now the general hostility of the Kentuckians, because as a crowd of meddlesome furriners they would be siding with the Virginians in the general enmity already alive. Moreover, now that the feud threatened activity over in Kentucky, more trouble must come, too, from that source, as the talk that came through the Gap after young Dave Tolliver's arrest plainly indicated. Town ordinances had been passed. The wild centaurs were no longer allowed to ride up and down the plank walks of Saturdays with their reins in their teeth and firing a pistol into the ground with either hand. They could punctuate the hotel sign no more. They could not ride at a fast gallop through the streets of the town and lost spirit of American liberty. They could not even yell. But the lawlessness of the town itself and its close environment was naturally the first objective point, and the first problem involved was moonshine and its faithful ally, the blind tiger. The tiger is a little shanty with an ever-open mouth, a hole in the door like a post-office window. You place your money on the sill, and at the ring of a coin a mysterious arm emerges from the hole, sweeps the money away, and leaves a bottle of white whiskey. Thus you see nobody's face. The owner of the beast is safe, and so are you, which you might not be if you saw and told. In every little hollow about the Gap a tiger had his lair, and these were all bearded at once by a petition to the county judge for high-licensed saloons, which was granted. This measure drove the tigers out of business and concentrated moonshine in the heart of the town, where its devotees were under easy guard. One tiger only, indeed, was left, run by a round-shouldered, crouching creature whom Bob Berkley, now at Hale's solicitation a policeman and known as the Infant of the Guard, dubbed Caliban. His shanty stood midway in the gap, high from the road, set against a dark clump of pines and roared at by the river beneath. Everybody knew he sold whiskey, but he was too shrewd to be caught until late one afternoon, 2 days after young Dave's arrest. Hale, coming through the gap into town, glimpsed a sulking figure with a hand-barrel as it slipped from the dark pines into Caliban's cabin, pulled in his horse, dismounted, and deliberated. If he went on down the road now, they would see him and suspect. Moreover, the patrons of the Tiger would not appear until after dark, and he wanted a prisoner, too. So Hale led his horse up into the bushes and came back to a covert by the roadside to watch and wait. As he sat there, a merry whistle sounded down the road, and Hale smiled. Soon the Infant of the Guard came along, his hands in his pockets, his cap on the back of his head, his pistol bumping his hip in manly fashion, and making the ravines echo with his pursed lips. He stopped in front of Hale, looked toward the river, drew his revolver, and aimed it at a floating piece of wood. The revolver cracked, the piece of wood skidded on the surface of the water, and there was no splash. "That was a pretty good shot," said Hale in a low voice. The boy whirled and saw him. "Well, what are you—" "Easy, easy," cautioned Hale. "Listen. I've just seen a moonshiner go into Caliban's cabin." The boy's eager eyes sparkled. "Let's go after him." "No, you go on back. If you don't, they'll be suspicious. Get another man." Hale almost laughed at the disappointment in the lad's face at his first words, and the joy that came after it, "and climb high above the shanty and come back here to me. Then after dark we'll dash in and cinch Caliban and his customers." "Yes, sir," said the lad. "Shall I whistle going back?" Hale nodded approval. Just the same, and off Bob went, whistling like a calliope and not even turning his head to look at the cabin. In half an hour Hale thought he heard something crashing through the bushes high on the mountainside, and a little while afterward the boy crawled through the bushes to him alone. His cap was gone, there was a bloody scratch across his face, and he was streaming with perspiration. "You'll have to excuse me, sir," he panted. "I didn't see anybody but one of my brothers, and if I had told him he wouldn't have let me come, and I hurried back for fear something would happen." "Well, suppose I don't let you go?" "Excuse me, sir, but I don't see how you can very well help. You aren't my brother, and you can't go alone." "I was," said Hale. "Yes, sir, but not now." Hale was worried, but there was nothing else to be done. "All right, I'll let you go if you stop saying 'sir' to me. It makes me feel so old." "Certainly, sir," said the lad quite unconsciously, and when Hale smothered a laugh, he looked around to see what had amused him. Darkness fell quickly, and into the gathering gloom they saw 2 more figures sulk into the cabin. "We'll go now, for we want the fellow who's selling the moonshine." Again Hale was beset with doubts about the boy and his own responsibility to the boy's brothers. The lad's eyes were shining, but his face was more eager than excited, and his hand was as steady as Hale's own. "You slip around and station yourself behind that pine tree, just behind the cabin." The boy looked crestfallen. "And if anybody tries to get out of the back door, you halt him." "Is there a back door?" "I don't know," Hale said rather shortly. "You obey orders. I'm not your brother, but I'm your captain." "Beg your pardon, sir. Shall I go now?" "Yes, you'll hear me at the front door. They won't make any resistance." The lad stepped away with nimble caution high above the cabin, and he even took his shoes off before he slid lightly down to his place behind the pine. There was no back door, only a window, and his disappointment was bitter. Still, when he heard Hale at the front door, he meant to make a break for that window, and he waited in the still gloom. He could hear the rough talk and laughter within, and now and then a clink of a tin cup. By and by there was a faint noise in front of the cabin, and he steadied his nerves and his beating heart. Then he heard the door pushed violently in and Hale's cry, "Surrender!" Hale stood on the threshold with his pistol outstretched in his right hand. The door had struck something soft, and he said sharply again, Come out from behind that door. Hands up." At the same moment the back window flew open with a bang, and Bob's pistol covered the edge of the open door. Caliban had rolled from his box like a stupid animal. Two of his patrons sat dazed and staring from Hale to the boy's face at the window. A mountaineer stood in one corner with twitching fingers and shifting eyes like a caged wild thing, and forth issued from behind the door, quivering with anger, young Dave Tolliver. Hale stared at him amazed, and when Dave saw Hale, such a wave of fury surged over his face that Bob thought it best to attract his attention again, which he did by gently motioning at him with the barrel of his pistol. "Hold on there," he said quietly, and young Dave stood still. "Climb through that window, Bob, and collect the batteries," said Hale. "Sure, sir," said the lad, and with his pistol still prominently in the foreground, he threw his left leg over the sill, and as he climbed in he quoted with a grunt: "You always go in force to make an arrest." Grim and serious as he was, with June's cousin glowering at him, Hale could not help smiling. "You didn't go home after all," said Hale to young Dave, who clenched his hands and lips but answered nothing. "Or if you did, you got back pretty quick." And still Dave was silent. "Get 'em all, Bob?" In answer the boy went the rounds, feeling the pocket of each man's right hip and his left breast. "Yes, sir." "Unload 'em." The lad broke each of the 4 pistols, picked up a piece of twine and strung them together through each trigger guard. "Close that window and stand here at the door." With the boy at the door, Hale rolled the hand barrel to the threshold, and the white liquor gurgled joyously on the steps. "All right, come along," he said to the captives, and at last young Dave spoke. "What are you taking me for?" Hale pointed to the empty hand barrel, and Dave's answer was a look of scorn. "I never brought that here." "You were drinking illegal liquor in a blind tiger, and if you didn't bring it, you can prove that later. Anyhow, we'll want you as a witness." And Hale looked at the other mountaineer, who had turned his eyes quickly to Dave. Caliban led the way, with young Dave and Hale walked side by side with them, while Bob was escort for the other 2. The road ran along a high bank, and as Bob was adjusting the jangling weapons on his left arm, the strange mountaineer darted behind him and leaped headlong into the tops of thick rhododendron. Before Hale knew what had happened, the lad's pistol flashed. "Stop, boy!" he cried, horrified. "Don't shoot!" And he had to catch the lad to keep him from leaping after the runaway. The shot had missed. They heard the runaway splash into the river and go stumbling across it, and then there was silence. Young Dave laughed. "Uncle Judd'll be over here tomorrow to see about this." Hale said nothing, and they went on. At the door of the calaboose Dave balked and had to be pushed in by main force. They left him weeping and cursing with rage. "Go to bed, Bob," said Hale. "Yes, sir," said Bob, "just as soon as I get my lessons." Hale did not go to the boarding house that night. He feared to face June. Instead, he went to the hotel, to scraps of a late supper, and then to bed. He had hardly touched the pillow, it seemed, when somebody shook him by the shoulder. It was McFarland, and daylight was streaming through the window. "Gang of those Falins are here," McFarland said, "and they're after young Dave Tolliver, about a dozen of them. Young Buck is with them, and the sheriff. They say he shot a man over in the mountains yesterday." Hale sprang for his clothes. Here was a quandary. "If we turn him over to them, they'll kill him." McFarland nodded. "Of course, and if we leave him in that weak old calaboose, they'll get more help and take him out tonight. Then we'll take him to the county jail. They'll take him away from us." "No, they won't. You can go out and get as many shotguns as you can find and load them with buckshot." McFarland nodded approvingly and disappeared. Hale plunged his face in a basin of cold water, soaked his hair, and as he was mopping his face with a towel, there was a ponderous tread on the porch. The door opened without the formality of a knock, and Devil Judd Tolliver, with his hat on and belted with 2 huge pistols, stepped stooping within. His eyes, red with anger and loss of sleep, were glaring, and his heavy mustache and beard showed the twitching of his mouth. "Whar's Dave?" he said shortly. "In the calaboose." "Did you put him in?" "Yes," said Hale calmly. "Well, by God," the old man said with repressed fury, "you can't get him out too soon if you want to save trouble." "Look here, Judd," said Hale seriously. "You are one of the last men in the world I want to have trouble with for many reasons. But I'm an officer over here, and I'm no more afraid of you." Hale paused to let the fact sink in, and it did. "Than you are of me. Dave's been selling liquor." "He hain't," interrupted the old mountaineer. "He didn't bring that liquor over here. I know who done it." "All right," said Hale. "I'll take your word for it, and I'll let him out if you say so. But—" "Right now," thundered old Judd, "do you know that young Buck Falin and a dozen of his gang are over here after him?" The old man looked stunned. "What? Now?" "They're over there in the woods across the river now, and they want me to go give him up to them. They say they have the sheriff with them, and they want him for shooting a man on Leatherwood Creek day before yesterday." "It's all a lie!" burst out old Judd. "They want to kill him." "Of course, and I was going to take him up to the county jail right away for safe keeping." "Do you mean to say you'd throw that boy into jail and then fight them Falins to protect him?" the old man asked slowly, incredulously. Hale pointed to a two-story building through his window. "If you get in the back part of that store at a window, you can see whether I will or not. I can summon you to help, and if a fight comes up, you can do your share from the window." The old man's eyes lighted up like a leaping flame. "Will you let Dave out and give him Winchester and help us fight him?" he said eagerly. "We three can whip 'em all." "No," said Hale shortly. "I'll try to keep both sides from fighting, and I'd arrest Dave or you as quickly as I would a Falin." The average mountaineer has little conception of duty in the abstract, but old Judd belonged to the better class, and there are many of them that does. He looked into Hale's eyes long and steadily. "All right." McFarland came in hurriedly and stopped short, seeing the hatted, bearded giant. "This is Mr. Tolliver, an uncle of Dave's, Judd Tolliver," said Hale. "Go ahead." "I've got everything fixed, but I couldn't get but 5 of the fellows. 2 of the Berkeley boys, they wouldn't let me go tell Bob." "All right. Can I summon Mr. Tolliver here?" "Yes," said McFarland doubtfully, "but you know—" "He won't be seen," interrupted Hale understandingly. "He'll be at a window in the back of that store, and he won't take part unless a fight begins, and if it does, we'll need him." An hour later Devil Judd Tolliver was in the store, Hale pointed out, and peering cautiously around the edge of an open window at the wooden gate of the ramshackle calaboose. Several Falins were there, led by young Buck, whom Hale recognized as the red-headed youth at the head of the tearing horsemen who had swept by him that late afternoon when he was coming back from his first trip to Lonesome Cove. The old man gritted his teeth as he looked, and he put one of his huge pistols on a table within easy reach and kept the other clenched in his right fist. From down the street came 5 horsemen, led by John Hale. Every man carried a double-barreled shotgun, and the old man smiled, and his respect for Hale rose higher, high as it already was, for nobody, mountaineer or not, has love for a hostile shotgun. The Falins, armed only with pistols, drew near. "Keep back," he heard Hale say calmly, and they stopped, young Buck alone going on. "We want that feller," said young Buck. "Well, you don't get him," said Hale quietly. "He's our prisoner. Keep back," he repeated, motioning with the barrel of his shotgun, and young Buck moved backward to his own men. The old man saw Hale and another man, the sergeant, go inside the heavy gate of the stockade. He saw a boy in a cap with a pistol in one hand and a strapped set of books in the other come running up to the men with the shotguns, and he heard one of them say angrily, "I told you not to come." "I know you did," said the boy imperturbably. "You go on to school," said another of the men, but the boy with the cap shook his head and dropped his books to the ground. The big gate opened just then, and out came Hale and the sergeant, and between them young Dave, his eyes blinking in the sunlight. "Damn ye," he heard Dave say to Hale, "I'll get even with you for this some day." And then the prisoner's eyes caught the horses and shotguns and turned to the group of Falins, and he shrank back, utterly dazed. There was a movement among the Falins, and Devil Judd caught up his other pistol, and with a grim smile got ready. Young Buck had turned to his crowd. "Men," he said, "you know I'll never back down." Devil Judd knew that, too, and he was amazed by the words that followed. "And if you say so,
we'll have him or die. But we ain't in our own state now. They got the law and the shotguns on us, and I reckon we'd better go slow."
The rest seemed quite willing to go slow, and as they put their pistols up, Devil Judd laughed in his beard. Hale put young Dave on a horse, and the little shotgun cavalcade quietly moved away toward the county seat. The crestfallen Falins dispersed the other way, after they had taken a parting shot at the Honorable Samuel Budd, who too had a pistol in his hand. Young Buck looked long at him, and then he laughed.
"You too, Sam Budd," he said. "We folks'll recollect this on election day."
The Honorable Sam deigned no answer, and up at the store Devil Judd lighted his pipe and sat down to think out the strange code of ethics that governed that police guard. Hale had told him to wait there, and it was almost noon before the boy with the cap came to tell him that the Falins had all left town. The old man looked at him kindly.
"Air you that little feller what fit for June?"
"Not yet," said Bob, "but it's comin'."
"Well, you'll whoop him."
"I'll do my best."
"Where is she?"
"She's waitin' for you over at the boarding house."
"Does she know about this trouble?"
"Not a thing. She thinks you've come to take her home." The old man made no answer. Bob led him back toward Hale's office. June was waiting at the gate, and the boy, lifting his cap, passed on. June's eyes were dark with anxiety.
"You come to take me home, Dad?"
"Been thinking about it," he said, with a doubtful shake of his head. June took him upstairs to her room and pointed out the old water wheel through the window. In her new clothes, she had put on her old homespun again when she heard he was in town, and the old man shook his head.
"I'm feared about all these fixin's. You won't never be satisfied again in Lonesome Cove."
"Why, Dad," she said reprovingly, "Jack says I can go over whenever I please, as soon as the weather gets warmer and the roads gets good."
"I don't know,"
said the old man, still shaking his head. All through dinner she was worried. Devil Judd hardly ate anything, so embarrassed was he by the presence of so many furriners, and by the white cloth and tableware, and so fearful was he that he would be guilty of some breach of manners. Resolutely he refused butter, and at the third urging by Mrs. Crane, he said firmly, but with a shrewd twinkle in his eye,
"No, thank ye. I never eats butter in town. I've kept store myself."
And he was no little pleased with the laugh that went around the table. The fact was, he was generally pleased with June's environment, and after dinner he stopped teasing June.
"Nah, honey, I ain't goin' to take you away. I want ye to stay right where ye air. Be a good girl, now, and do whatever Jack Hale tells ye, and tell that boy with all that hair to come over and see me."
June grew almost tearful with gratitude, for never had he called her honey before that she could remember, and never had he talked so much to her, nor with such kindness.
"Air you comin' over soon?"
"Mighty soon, Dad."
"Well, take care of yourself."
"I will, Dad," she said, and tenderly she watched his great figure slouch out of sight. An hour after dark, as old Judd sat on the porch of the cabin in Lonesome Cove, young Dave Tolliver rode up to the gate on a strange horse. He was in a surly mood.
"You let me go at the head of the valley and give me this horse to get here," the boy grudgingly explained. "I'm goin' over to get mine tomorrow." "Seems like you'd better keep away from that gap," said the old man dryly, and Dave reddened angrily. "Yes, and first thing you know he'll be over here after you." The old man turned on him sternly. "Jack Hale knows that liquor was mine. He knows I've got a still over here as well as you do, and he's never asked a question nor peeped an eye. I reckon he could come if he thought he oughter, but I'm on this side of the state line. If I was on his side, maybe I'd stop." Young Dave stared, for things were surely coming to a pretty pass in Lonesome Cove. "And I reckon," the old man went on, "it'd be better grace in you to stop sayin' things agin him, for if it hadn't been for him, you'd be laid out by them Falins by this time." It was true, and Dave, silenced, was forced into another channel. "I wonder," he said presently, "how them Falins always know when I go over thar." "I've been studying about that myself," said Devil Judd. Inside, the old stepmother had heard Dave's query. "I seed the Red Fox this afternoon," she quavered at the door. "What was he doing over here?" asked Dave. "Nothin'," she said. "Just a sneakin' around the way he always is doin'. Seemed like he was mighty particular to find out when you was comin' back."
Both men started slightly.
"We're all Tollivers now, all right," said the Honorable Samuel Budd that night while he sat with Hale on the porch overlooking the mill pond, and then he groaned a little. "Them Falins have got kinfolks to burn on the Virginia side, and they'd fight me tooth and toenail for this 100 years hence."
He puffed his pipe, but Hale said nothing.
"Yes, sir," he added cheerily, "we're in for a hell of a merry time now. The mountaineer hates as long as he remembers, and he never forgets."
End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 15. Hand in hand, Hale and June followed the footsteps of spring from the time June met him at the schoolhouse gate for their first walk in the woods. Hale pointed to some boys playing marbles. "That's the first sign," he said with quick understanding. June smiled. The bird-like piping of hylas came from a marshy strip of woodland that ran through the center of the town, and a toad was croaking at the foot of Imboden Hill. And they came next. They crossed the swinging footbridge, which was a miracle to June, and took the footpath along the clear stream of South Fork, under the laurel which June called ivy, and the rhododendron which was laurel in her speech. And Hale pointed out catkins greening on alders in one swampy place, and willows just blushing into life along the banks of a little creek. A few yards aside from the path he found under a patch of snow and dead leaves the pink and white blossoms and the waxy green leaves of the trailing arbutus, that fragrant harbinger of the old mother's awakening, and June breathed in from the very breath of spring. Near by were turkey peas which she had hunted and eaten many times. "You can't put that arbutus in a garden," said Hale. "It's as wild as a hawk." Presently he had the little girl listen to a pewee twittering in a thorn bush, and the lusty call of a robin from an apple tree. A bluebird flew overhead with a merry chirp, its wistful note of autumn long since forgotten. These were the first birds and flowers, he said, and June, knowing them only by sight, must know the name of each and the reason for that name, so that Hale found himself walking the woods with an interrogation point. And that he might not be confounded, he had later to dip up much forgotten lore. For every walk became a lesson in botany for June, such a passion did she betray at once for flowers, and he rarely had to tell her the same thing twice, since her memory was like a vice for everything, as he learned in time. Her eyes were quicker than his, too, and now she pointed to a snowy blossom with a deeply lobed leaf. "What's that?" "Bloodroot," said Hale, and he scratched the stem, and forth issued scarlet drops. "The Indians used to put it on their faces in tomahawks." She knew that word and nodded. "And I used to make red ink of it when I was a little boy." "No," said June. With the next look she found a tiny bunch of fuzzy hibiscus. "Liver leaf." "What's liver?" Hale, looking at her glowing face and eyes and her perfect little body, imagined that she would never know unless told that she had one, and so he waved one hand vaguely at his chest. "It's an organ, and that herb is supposed to be good for it." "Organ? What's that?" "Oh, something inside you." June made the same gesture that Hale had. "Me?" "Yes," and then hopelessly, "but not there exactly." June's eyes had caught something else now, and she ran for it. "Oh!" It was a bunch of delicate anemones of intermediate shades between white and red, yellow, pink, and purple blue. "Those are anemones." "Anemones," repeated June. Windflowers, because the wind is supposed to open them. And almost unconsciously Hale lapsed into a quotation. And where a tear has dropped, a windflower blows.
What's that?
Said June quickly. That's poetry.
What's poetry?
Hale threw up both hands. I don't know, but I'll read you some day. By that time she was gurgling with delight over a bunch of spring beauties that came up, root, stock, and all, when she reached for them.
Well, ain't they purty?
While they lay in her hand and she looked, the rose-veined petals began to close, the leaves to droop, and the stem go limp.
Oh, crooned June, I won't pull up no more of them.
These little dream flowers found in the spring. More poetry, June. A little later he heard her repeating that line to herself. It was an easy step from poetry to flowers, and apparently June was groping for it. A few days later the serviceberries swung out, white stars on the low hillsides, but Hale could tell her nothing that she did not know about the serviceberry. Soon the dogwood swept in snowy gusts along the mountains, and from a bank of it one morning a redbird flamed and sang, "What cheer, what cheer, what cheer!" And like its scarlet coat, the red bud had just burst into bloom. June knew the redbud, but she had never heard it called the Judas tree. You see, the red bud was supposed to be poisonous. It shakes in the wind and says to the bees, "Come on, little fellows, here's your nice fresh honey," and when they come it betrays and poisons them.
"Well, what do you think of that?"
said June indignantly, and Hale had to hedge a bit.
"Well, I don't know whether it really does, but
that's what they say." A little farther on the white stars of the trillium gleamed at them from the border of the woods, and nearby June stooped over some lovely sky-blue blossoms with yellow eyes. "Forget-me-nots," said Hale. June stooped to gather them with a radiant face.
"Oh," she said, "is that what you call 'em?"
"They aren't the real ones. They're false forget-me-nots."
"Then I don't want 'em,"
said June. But they were beautiful and fragrant, and she added gently,
"'Tain't their fault. I'm goin' to call 'em just forget-me-nots, and I'm givin' 'em to you," she said, "so that you won't."
"Thank you," said Hale gravely. "I won't." They found larkspur, too. "Blue as the heaven it gazes at," quoted Hale.
"What gazes?"
"Looks." June looked up at the sky and down at the flower.
"'Tain't," she said. "It's bluer."
When he discovered something Hale did not know, he would say it was one of those wandflowers without a name.
"My," said June at last, "seems like them wandflowers is a mighty big family."
"They are," laughed Hale, "for a bachelor like me."
"Huh?"
said June. Later they ran upon a yellow adder's tongues in a hollow, each blossom guarded by a pair of ear-like leaves. Dutchman's breeches and wild bleeding hearts, a name that appealed greatly to the fancy of the romantic little lady, and thus together they followed the footsteps of that spring. And while she studied the flowers, Hale was studying the loveliest flower of them all, little June. About ferns, plants, and trees as well, he told her all he knew, and there seemed nothing in the skies, the green world of the leaves, or the underworld at her feet to which she was not magically responsive. Indeed, Hale had never seen a man, woman, or child so eager to learn. And one day, when she had apparently reached the limit of inquiry, she grew very thoughtful, and he watched her in silence a long while. "What's the matter, June?" he asked finally.
"I was just wonderin' why. I'm always askin' why,"
said little June. She was learning in school, too, and she was happier there now, for there had been no more open teasing of the new pupil. Bob's championship saved her from that, and thereafter school changed straightway for June. Before that day she had kept apart from her schoolfellows at recess times as well as in the schoolroom. 2 or 3 of the girls had made friendly advances to her, but she had shyly repelled them. Why, she hardly knew, and it was her lonely custom at recess time to build a playhouse at the foot of a great beech with moss, broken bits of bottles, stones. Once she found it torn to pieces, and from the look on the face of the tall mountain boy, Cal Heaton, who had grinned at her when she went up for her first lesson, and who was now Bob's arch enemy. She knew that he was the guilty one. Again, a day or two later, it was destroyed, and when she came down from the woods almost in tears, Bob happened to meet her in the road, and he made her tell the trouble she was in. Straightway he charged the trespasser with the deed, and was lied to for his pains. So after school that day he slipped up on the hill with the little girl and helped her rebuild again. "Now I'll lay for him," said Bob, "and catch him at it." "All right," said June, and she looked both her worry and her gratitude, so that Bob understood both, and he answered both with a nonchalant wave of one hand. "Never you mind, and don't you tell Mr. Hale," and June in dumb acquiescence crossed her heart and body. But the mountain boy was wary, and for 2 or 3 days the playhouse was undisturbed, and so Bob himself laid a trap. He mounted his horse immediately after school, rode past the mountain lad who was on his way home, crossed the river, made a wide detour at a gallop, and hitching his horse in the woods, came to the playhouse from the other side of the hill. And half an hour later, when the pale little teacher came out of the schoolhouse, he heard grunts and blows and scuffling up in the woods, and when he ran toward the sound, the bodies of 2 of his pupils rolled into sight, clenched fiercely, with torn clothes and bleeding faces, Bob on top with the mountain boy's thumb in his mouth, and his own fingers gripped about his antagonist's throat. Neither paid any attention to the schoolmaster, who pulled at Bob's coat unwaveringly and with horror at his ferocity. Bob turned his head, shook it as well as the thumb in his mouth would let him, and went on gripping the throat under him and pushing the head that belonged to it on the ground. The mountain boy's tongue showed and his eyes bulged. "Enough!" he yelled. Bob rose and told his story, and the schoolmaster from New England gave them a short lecture on gentleness and Christian charity, and fixed on each the awful penalty of staying in after school for an hour every day for a week. Bob grinned. "All right, Professor, it was worth it," he said, but the mountain lad shuffled silently away. An hour later Hale saw the boy with a swollen lip, one eye black and the other as merry as ever, but after that there was no more trouble for June. Bob had made his promise good, and gradually she came into the games with her fellows thereafter, while Bob stood or sat aside, encouraging but taking no part. For was he not a member of the police force? Indeed, he was already known far and wide as the infant of the guard, and always he carried a whistle, and usually outside the schoolhouse a pistol bumped his hip, while a Winchester stood in one corner of his room, and a billy dangled by his mantelpiece. The games were new to June, and often Hale would stroll up to the schoolhouse to watch them. Prisoner's base, skipping the rope, ante over, cracking the whip, and lifting the gate, and it pleased him to see how lithe and active his little protege was, and more than a match in strength even for the boys who were near her size. June had to take the penalty of her greenness, too, when she was introduced to the king and queen, and bumped the ground between the make-believe sovereigns, or got a cup of water in her face when she was trying to see stars through a pipe, and the boys pinned her dress to the bench through a crack, and once she walked into school with a placard on her back which read, "June Bug," but she was so good-natured that she fast became a favorite. Indeed, it was noticeable to Hale as well as Bob that Carl Heaton, the mountain boy, seemed always to get next to June in the tugs of war, and one morning June found an apple on her desk. She swept the room with a glance and met Carl's guilty flush, and though she ate the apple, she gave him no thanks, in word, look, or manner. It was curious to Hale, moreover, to observe how June's instinct deftly led her to avoid the mistakes in dress that characterized the groupings of other girls who, like her, were in a stage of transition. They wore gaudy combs and green skirts with red waists, their clothes bunched at the hips, and to their shoes and hands they paid no attention at all. None of these things for June, and Hale did not know that the little girl had leaped her fellows with one bound, had taken Miss Ann Saunders as her model, and was climbing upon the pedestal where that lady justly stood. The two had not become friends, as Hale hoped. June was always silent and reserved when the older girl was around, but there was never a move of the latter's hand or foot or lip or eye that the new pupil failed to see. Miss Anne rallied Hale no little about her, but he laughed good-naturedly and asked why she could not make friends with June. "She's jealous," said Miss Saunders, and Hale ridiculed the idea, for not one sign since she came to the Gap had she shown him. It was the jealousy of a child she had once betrayed and that she had outgrown, he thought. But he never knew how June stood behind the curtains of her window, with a hungry suffering in her face and eyes, to watch Hale and Miss Anne ride by, and he never guessed that concealment was but a sign of the dawn of womanhood that was breaking within her. And she gave no hint of that breaking dawn until one day early in May, when she heard a wood thrush for the first time with Hale, for it was the bird she loved best, and always its silver fluting would stop her in her tracks and send her into dreamland. Hale had just broken a crimson flower from its stem and held it out to her. "Here's another of the wan ones, June. Do you know what that is?" "It's—" she paused for correction, with her lips drawn severely in the precision. "It's a mountain poppy. Pap says it kills goslings." Her eyes danced, for she was in a merry mood, and she put both hands behind her. "If you're any kin to a goose, you better drop it." "That's a good one," laughed Hale, "but it's so lovely I'll take the risk. I won't drop it." "Drop it," caught June with a quick upward look, and then, to fix the word in her memory, she repeated, "Drop it, drop it, drop it." "Got it now, June?" "Uh-huh." It was then that a wood thrush voiced the crowning joy of spring, and with slowly filling eyes she asked its name. "That bird," she said slowly with a breaking voice, "sung just that-a-way the mornin' my sister died." She turned to him with a wondering smile. "Somehow it don't make me so miserable like it used to." Her smile passed while she looked. She caught both hands to her heaving breast, and a wild intensity burned suddenly in her eyes. "Why, June, 'tain't nothin'," she choked out, and she turned hurriedly ahead of him down the path. Startled, Hale had dropped the crimson flower to his feet. He saw it, and he let it lie. Meanwhile, rumors were brought in that the Falins were coming over from Kentucky to wipe out the Guard, and so straight were they sometimes that the Guard was kept perpetually on watch. Once, while the members were at a target practice, the shout arose, "The Kentuckians are coming! The Kentuckians are coming!" And a double quick the Guard rushed back to find it a false alarm, and to see men laughing at them in the street. The truth was that while the Falins had a general hostility against the Guard, their particular enmity was concentrated on John Hale, as he discovered when June was to take her first trip home one Friday afternoon. Hale meant to carry it over, but the morning they were to leave, old Jud Tolliver came to the Gap himself. He did not want June to come home at that time, and he didn't think it was safe over there for Hale just then. Some of the Falins had been seen hanging around Lonesome Cove for the purpose, Judd believed, of getting a shot at the man who had kept young Dave from falling into their hands, and Hale saw that by that act he had, as Bud said, arrayed himself with the Tollivers in the feud. In other words, he was a Tolliver himself now, and as such the Falins meant to treat him. Hale rebelled against the restriction, for he had started some work in Lonesome Cove and was preparing a surprise over there for June. But old Judd said, "Just wait a while," and he said it so seriously that Hale for a while took his advice. So June stayed at the Gap, with little disappointment apparently that she could not visit home, and as spring passed and the summer came on, the little girl budded and opened like a rose. To the pretty school teacher she was a source of endless interest and wonder. For a while the little girl was reticent and aloof. Miss Saunders felt herself watched and studied in and out of school, and Hale often had to smile at June's unconscious imitation of her teacher in speech, manners, and dress. And all the time her hero worship of Hale went on, fed by the talk of the boarding house, her fellow pupils, and the town at large, and it fairly thrilled her to know that to the Falins he was now a Tolliver himself. Sometimes Hale would get her a saddle, and then June would usurp Miss Anne's place in a horseback ride up through the Gap to see the first blooms of the purple rhododendron on Bee Rock, or up to Morris's farm on Powell's Mountain, from which, with a glass, you could see the Lonesome Pine. And all the time she worked at her studies tirelessly, and when she was done with her lessons she read the fairy books that Hale got for her, read them until Paul and Virginia fell into her hands, and then there was no more fairy stories for little June. Often, late at night, Hale from the porch of his cottage could see the light of her lamp sending its beam across the dark water of the mill pond, and finally he got worried by the paleness of her face and sent her to the doctor. She went unwillingly, and when she came back she reported placidly that, organically, she was all right, the doctor said. But Hale was glad that vacation would soon come. At the beginning of the last week of school he brought a little present for her from New York, a slender necklace of gold with a little reddish stone pendant that was the shape of a cross. Hale pulled the trinket from his pocket as they were walking down the river bank at sunset, and the little girl quivered like an aspen leaf in a sudden puff of wind. "It's a fairy stone," she cried excitedly. "Why, where on earth did you—" "Why, Sister Sally told me about 'em," she said. "Folks found 'em everywhere over here in Virginia, and all her life she was a-wishin' for one, and she could never get it." Her eyes filled. "Seems like everything she wanted is a-comin' to me." "Do you know the story of it, too?" asked Hale. June shook her head. "Sister Sally said it was a luck piece. Nothin' could happen to you when you carried it, but I was awful bad luck if you lost it." Hale put it around her neck and fastened the clasp, and June kept hold of the little cross with one hand. "Well, you mustn't lose it," he said. "Oh, no, no," she repeated breathlessly, and Hale told her the pretty story of the stone as they strolled back to supper. The little crosses were to be found only in a certain valley in Virginia, so perfect in shape that they seemed to have been chiseled by hand, and they were a great mystery to the men who knew all about rocks, the geologists. "The geologists," repeated June. "These men said there was no crystallization, nothing like them," amended Hale, "elsewhere in the world, and that just as crosses were as different of shapes, Roman, Maltese, and St. Andrews, so, too, these crosses were found in all these different shapes. And the myth, the story, was that this little valley was once inhabited by fairies." June's eyes lighted, for it was a fairy story after all, and that when a strange messenger brought them the news of Christ's crucifixion they wept, and their tears as they fell to the ground were turned into tiny crosses of stone. Even the Indians had some queer feeling about them, and for a long, long time people who found them had used them as charms to bring good luck and ward off harm. "And that's for you," he said, "because you've been such a good little girl and have studied so hard. School's most over now, and I reckon you'll be right glad to get home again." June made no answer, but at the gate she looked suddenly up at him. "Hey, have you got one, too?" she asked, and she seemed much disturbed when Hale shook his head. "Well, I'll get you one some day." "All right," laughed Hale. There was again something strange in her manner as she turned suddenly from him, and what it meant he was soon to learn. It was the last week of school, and Hale had just come down from the woods behind the schoolhouse at little recess time in the afternoon. The children were playing games outside the gate, and Bob and Miss Anne and the little Professor were leaning on the fence watching them. The little man raised his hand to halt Hale on the plank sidewalk. "Been waiting to see you," he said in his dreamy, abstracted way. "You prophesied, you know, that I should be proud of your little protégée some day, and I am indeed. She is the most remarkable pupil I've yet seen here, and I have about come to the conclusion that there is no quicker native intelligence in our country than you shall find in the children of these mountaineers, and—" Miss Anne was gazing at the children with an expression that turned Hale's eyes that way, and the Professor checked his harangue. Something had happened. They had been playing Ring Around the Rosy, and June had been caught. She stood scarlet and tense, and the cry was, "Who's your beau? Who's your beau?" And still she stood with tight lips, flushing. "You got to tell, you got to tell." The mountain boy, Cal Heaton,
was grinning with facetious consciousness, and even Bob put his hands in his pockets and took on an uneasy smile. "Who's your beau?" came the chorus again. The lips opened almost in a whisper, but all could hear. "Jack." "Jack who?" But June looked around and saw the four at the gate. Almost staggering, she broke from the crowd and, with one forearm across her scarlet face, rushed past them into the schoolhouse. Miss Anne looked at Hale's amazed face, and she did not smile. Bob turned respectfully away, ignoring it all, and the little professor, whose life purpose was psychology, murmured in his ignorance, "Very remarkable, very remarkable." Through that afternoon June kept her hot face close to her books. Bob never so much as glanced her way, little gentleman that he was. But the one time she lifted her eyes, she met the mountain lad's bent in a stupor gaze upon her. In spite of her apparent studiousness, however, she missed her lesson, and automatically the little professor told her to stay in after school and recite to Miss Saunders, and so June and Miss Anne sat in the schoolroom alone, the teacher reading a book and the pupil, her tears unshed, with her sullen face bent over her lesson. In a few moments the door opened and the little professor thrust in his head. The girl had looked so hurt and tired when he spoke to her that some strange sympathy moved him, mystified though he was, to say gently now, and with a warm smile that was rare with him, "You might excuse June, I think, Miss Saunders, and let her recite some time tomorrow." And gently he closed the door. Miss Anne rose. "Very well, June," she said quietly. June rose too, gathering up her books, and as she passed the teacher's platform, she stopped and looked her full in the face. She said not a word, and the tragedy between the woman and the girl was played in silence, for the woman knew from the searching gaze of the girl and the black defiance in her eyes as she stalked out of the room that her own flush had betrayed her secret as plainly as the girl's words had told hers. Through his office window a few minutes later Hale saw June pass swiftly into the house. In a few minutes she came swiftly out again and went back swiftly towards the schoolhouse. He was so worried by the tense look in her face that he could work no more, and in a few minutes he threw his papers down and followed her. When he turned the corner, Bob was coming down the street with his cap on the back of his head and swinging his books by a strap, and the boy looked a little conscious when he saw Hale coming. "Have you seen June?" Hale asked. "No, sir," said Bob, immensely relieved. "Did she come up this way?" "I don't know, but—" Bob turned and pointed to the green dome of a big beech. "Think you'll find her at the foot of that tree," he said. "That's where her playhouse is, and that's where she goes when that's where she usually goes." "Oh, yes," said Hale, "her playhouse. Thank you." "Not all, sir." Hale went on, turned from the path, and climbed noiselessly. When he caught sight of the beech, he stopped still. June stood against it like a wood nymph just emerged from its sun-dappled trunk, stood stretched to her full height, her hands behind her, her hair tossed, her throat tense under the dangling little cross, her face uplifted. At her feet the playhouse was scattered to pieces. She seemed listening to the love calls of a wood thrush that came faintly through the still woods, and then he saw that she heard nothing, saw nothing, that she was in a dream as deep as sleep. Hale's heart throbbed as he looked. "June!" he called softly. She did not hear him, and when he called again, she turned her face, unstartled, and moving her posture not at all. Hale pointed to the scattered playhouse. "I done it," she said fiercely. "I done it myself." Her eyes burned steadily into his even while she lifted her hands to her hair as though she were only vaguely conscious that it was all undone. "You heard me," she cried, and before he could answer, "She heard me." And again, not waiting for a word from him, she cried still more fiercely, I don't care who knows." Her hands were trembling, she was biting her quivering lip to keep back the starting tears, and Hale rushed toward her and took her in his arms. "June, June," he said brokenly, "you mustn't, little girl. I'm proud, why, little sweetheart." She was clinging to him and looking up into his eyes, and he bent his head slowly. Their lips met, and the man was startled. He knew now it was no child that answered him. Hale walked long that night in the moonlit woods, up and around Imboden Hill, along a shallow, haunted path between silvery beech trunks, past the big hole in the earth from which dead trees tossed out their crooked arms as if in torment, and to the top of the ridge under which the valley slept, and above which the dark bulk of Powell's Mountain rose. It was absurd, but he found himself strangely stirred. She was a child, he kept repeating to himself, in spite of the fact that he knew she was no child among her own people, and that mountain girls were even wives who were younger still. Still, she did not know what she felt. How could she? And she would get over it. And then came the sharp stab of a doubt. Would he want her to get over it? Frankly and with wonder he confessed to himself that he did not know. He did not know. But again, why bother? He had meant to educate her anyhow. That was the first step. No matter what happened, June must go out into the world, to school. He would have plenty of money. Her father would not object, and June need never know. He could include for her an interest in her own father's coal lands that he meant to buy, and she could think that it was her own money that she was using. So, with a sudden rush of gladness from his brain to his heart, he recklessly yoked himself, then and there, under all responsibility for that young life and the eager, sensitive soul that already lighted it so radiantly. And June? Her nature had opened precisely as the bud and flower of that spring. The mother of magicians had touched her as impartially as she had touched them with fairy wand, and as unconsciously the little girl had answered as a young dove to any cooing mate. With this Hale did not reckon, and this June could not know. For a while that night she lay in a delicious tremor, listening to the bird-like chorus of the little frogs in the marsh, the booming of the big ones in the mill pond, the water pouring over the dam with the sound of a low wind, and, as had all the sleeping things of the earth about her, she too sank to happy sleep. End of chapter 15.
Of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Storm. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox Jr. Chapter 16. The in-sweep of the outside world was broadening its current now. The improvement company had been formed to encourage the growth of the town. A safe was put in the back part of a furniture store behind a wooden partition, and a bank was started. Up through the Gap and toward Kentucky more entries were driven into the coal, and on the Virginia side were signs of stripping for iron ore. A furnace was coming in just as soon as the railroad could bring it in, and the railroad was pushing ahead with genuine vigor. Speculators were trooping in, and the town had been divided off into lots, a few of which had already changed hands. One agent had brought in a big steel safe and a tent, and was buying coal lands right and left. More young men drifted in from all points of the compass. The tent hotel was put at the foot of Imboden Hill, and of nights there were under it much poker and song. The lilt of a definite optimism was in every man's step, and the light of hope was in every man's eye. And the guard went to its work in earnest. Every man now had his Winchester, his revolver, his billy, and his whistle. Drilling and target shooting became a daily practice. Bob, who had been a year in a military school, was drill master for the recruits, and very gravely he performed his duties and put them through the skirmishers' drill, advancing in rushes, throwing themselves in the new grass, and very gravely he commended one enthusiast, none other than the Honorable Samuel Budd, who, rather than lose his position in line, threw himself into a pool of water, all to the surprise, scorn, and anger of the mountain onlookers who dwelled about the town. Many were the comments the members of the guard heard from them, even while they were at drill. I'd like to see one of them fellers hit me with one of them locust posts. Huh! I could take 2 good men and run the whole batch out o' the county. Look at them dudes and furriners. They come into our country and they're tryin' to larn us how to run it. Our boys are only tryin' to have their little fun. They don't mean nothin', but some day some fool young guard'll hurt somebody and then there'll be hell to pay." Hale could not help feeling considerable sympathy for their point of view, particularly when he saw the mountaineers watching the guard at target practice, each volunteer policeman with his back to the target, and at the word of command wheeling and firing 6 shots in rapid succession. And he did not wonder at their snorts of scorn at such bad shooting, and their open anger that the guard was practicing for them. But sometimes he got an unexpected recruit. One bully, who had been conspicuous in the brickyard trouble, after watching a drill, went up to him with a grin. "Hell," he said cheerily, "I believe you fellers are going to have more fun than we are, and danged if I don't jine you, if you'll let me." "Sure," said Hale. And others, who might have been bad men, became members, and, thus getting a vent for their energies, were as enthusiastic for the law as they might have been against it. Of course, the antagonistic element in the town lost no opportunity to plague and harass the guard, and after the destruction of the Blind Tigers, mischief was naturally concentrated in the high-licensed saloons, particularly in the one run by Jack Woods, whose local power for evil and cackling laugh seemed to mean nothing else than close personal communion with old Nick himself. Passing the door of his saloon one day, Bob saw one of Jack's customers trying to play pool with a Winchester in one hand and an open knife between his teeth, and the boy stepped in and halted. The man had no weapon concealed and was making no disturbance, and Bob did not know whether or not he had the legal right to arrest him. So he turned, and while he was standing in the door, Jack winked at his customer, who with a grin put the back of his knife blade between Bob's shoulders and, pushing, closed it. The boy looked over his shoulder without moving a muscle, but the Honorable Samuel Budd, who came in at that moment, pinioned the fellow's arms from behind, and Bob took his weapon away. "Hell," said the mountaineer, "I didn't aim to hurt the little feller. I just wanted to see if I could skeer him." "Well, brother, 'tis scarce a merry jest," quoth the Honorable Sam, and he looked sharply at Jack through his big spectacles as the two led the man off to the calaboose, for he suspected that the saloon keeper was at the bottom of the trick. Jack's time came only the next day. He had regarded it as the limit of indignity when an ordinance was up that nobody should blow a whistle except a member of the guard, and it was great fun for him to have some drunken customer blow a whistle and then stand in his door and laugh at the policemen running in from all directions. That day Jack tried the whistle himself, and Hale ran down. "Who did that?" he asked. Jack felt bold that morning. "I blowed it." Hale thought for a moment. The ordinance against blowing a whistle had not yet been passed, but he made up his mind that under the circumstances Jack's blowing was a breach of the peace, since the guard had adopted that signal. So he said, "You mustn't do that again." Jack had doubtless been going through precisely the same mental process, and on the nice legal point involved he seemed to differ. "I'll blow it when I damn please," he said. "Blow it again and I'll arrest you," said Hale. Jack blew. He had his right shoulder against the corner of his door at the time, and when he raised the whistle to his lips, Hale drew and covered him before he could make another move. Woods backed slowly into his saloon to get behind his counter. Hale saw his purpose and he closed in, taking great risk, as he always did, to avoid bloodshed, and there was a struggle. Jack managed to get his pistol out, but Hale caught him by the wrist and held the weapon away so that it was harmless as far as he was concerned. But a crowd was gathering at the door toward which the saloon keeper's pistol was pointed, and he feared that somebody out there might be shot, so he called out, "Drop that pistol!" The order was not obeyed, and Hale raised his right hand high above Jack's head and dropped the butt of his weapon on Jack's skull, hard. Jack's head dropped back between his shoulders, his eyes closed, and his pistol clicked on the floor. Hale knew how serious a thing a blow was in that part of the world, and what excitement it would create, and he was uneasy at Jack's trial for fear that the saloon keeper's friends would take the matter up. But they didn't, and, to the surprise of everybody, Jack quietly paid his fine, and thereafter the guard had little active trouble from the town itself, for it was quite plain there at least that the guard meant business. Across Black Mountain, old Dave Tolliver and old Buck Falin had got well of their wounds by this time, and though each swore to have vengeance against the other as soon as he was able to handle a Winchester, both factions seemed waiting for that time to come. Moreover, the Falins, because of a rumor that Bad Rufe Tolliver might come back, and because of Devil Judd's anger at their attempt to capture young Dave, grew wary and rather pacificatory, and so, beyond a little quarreling, a little threatening, and the exchange of a harmless shot or two, sometimes in banter, sometimes in earnest, nothing had been done. Sternly, however, though the Falins did not know the fact, Devil Judd continued to hold aloof, in spite of the pleadings of young Dave, and so confident was the old man in the balance of power that lay with him that he sent June word that he was coming to take her home. And, in truth, with Hale going away again on a business trip, and Bob too gone back home to the Bluegrass, and school closed, the little girl was glad to go, and she waited for her father's coming eagerly. Miss Anne was still there, to be sure, and if she too had gone, June would have been more content. The quiet smile of that astute young woman had told Hale plainly, and somewhat to his embarrassment, that she knew something had happened between the two, but that smile she never gave to June. Indeed, she never encountered aught else than the same silent, searching gaze from the strangely mature little creature's eyes, and when those eyes met the teacher's, always June's hand would wander unconsciously to the little cross at her throat, as though to invoke its aid against anything that could come between her and its giver. Purple rhododendrons on Bee Rock had come and gone, and the pink-flecked laurels were in bloom, when June fared forth one sunny morning of her own birth-month, behind old Judd Tolliver. Home. Back up through the wild gap they rode in silence, past Bee Rock, out of the chasm, and up the little valley toward the trail of the Lonesome Pine, into which the father's old sorrel nag, with the switch of her sunburned tail, turned leftward. June leaned forward a little, and there was the crest of the big tree, motionless in the blue high above, and sheltered by one big white cloud. It was the first time she had seen the pine since she had first left it, and little tremblings went through her from her bare feet to her bonneted head. Thus was she unclad, for Hale had told her that, to avoid criticism, she must go home clothed just as she was when she left Lonesome Cove. She did not quite understand that, and she carried her new clothes in a bundle in her lap, but she took Hale's word unquestioned. So she wore her crimson homespun and her bonnet, with her bronze gold hair gathered under it in the same old Psyche knot. She must wear her shoes, she told Hale, until she got out of town, else someone might see her, but Hale had said she would be leaving too early for that, and so she had gone from the gap as she had come into it, with unmittened hands and bare feet. The soft wind was very good to those dangling feet, and she itched to have them on the green grass or in the cool waters through which the old horse splashed. Yes, she was going home again, the same June as far as the mountain eyes could see, though she had grown perceptibly and her little face had blossomed from her heart almost into a woman's. But she knew that while her clothes were the same, they covered quite another girl. Time wings slowly for the young, and when the sensations are many and the experiences are new, slowly even for all, and thus there was a double reason why it seemed an age to June since her eyes at last rested on the big pine. Here was the place where Hale had put his big black horse into a dead run, and as vivid a thrill of it came back to her now as had been the thrill of the race. Then they began to climb laboriously up the rocky creek, the water singing a joyous welcome to her along the path, ferns and flowers nodding to her from dead leaves and rich mold and peeping at her from crevices between the rocks on the creek banks as high up as the level of her eyes, up under bending branches full-leafed, with the warm sunshine darting down through them upon her as she passed, and making a playfellow of her sunny hair. Here was the place where she had got angry with Hale, had slid from his horse and stormed with tears. What a little fool she had been when Hale had meant only to be kind. He was never anything but kind, Jack was. Dear, dear Jack. That wouldn't happen no more, she thought, and straightway she corrected that thought. It won't happen any more, she said aloud. What did you say, June? The old man lifted his bushy beard from his chest and turned his head. Nothing, Dad, she said, and old Judd, himself in a deep study, dropped back into it again. How often she had said that to herself, that it would happen no more. She had stopped saying it to Hale because he laughed and forgave her, and seemed to love her mood, whether she cried from joy or anger, and yet she kept on doing both just the same. Several times Devil Judd stopped to let his horse rest, and each time, of course, the wooded slopes of the mountains stretched downwards in longer sweeps of summer green, and across the widening valley the tops of the mountains beyond dropped nearer to the straight level of her eyes, while beyond them vaster blue bulks became visible and ran on, as they always seemed, to the farthest limits of the world. Even out there, Hale had told her, she would go some day. The last curving upsweep came finally, and there stood the big pine, majestic, unchanged, and murmuring in the wind like the undertone of a far-off sea. As they passed the base of it, she reached out her hand and let the tips of her fingers brush caressingly across its trunk, turned quickly for a last look at the sunlit valley and the hills of the outer world, and then the two passed into a green gloom of shadow and thick leaves that shut her heart in as suddenly as though some human hand had clutched it. She was going home, to see Bub and Loretta and Uncle Billy and old Hun and her stepmother and Dave, and yet she felt vaguely troubled. The valley on the other side was in dazzling sunshine, she had seen that. The sun must still be shining over there. It must be shining above her over here, for here and there shot a sunbeam message from that outer world down through the leaves, and yet it seemed that black night had suddenly fallen about her, and helplessly she wondered about it all, with her hands gripped tight and her eyes wide. But the mood was gone when they emerged at the deadening on the last spur, and she saw Lonesome Cove and the roof of her little home peacefully asleep in the same sun that shone on the valley over the mountain. Color came to her face and her heart beat faster. At the foot of the spur the road had been widened and showed signs of heavy hauling. There was sawdust in the mouth of the creek, and from coal dust the water was black. The ring of axes and the shouts of ox drivers came from the mountain side. Up the creek above her father's cabin 3 or 4 houses were being built of fresh boards, and there in front of her was a new store. To a fence one side of it 2 horses were hitched, and on one horse was a side saddle. Before the door stood the Red Fox and Uncle Billy, the miller, who peered at her for a moment through his big spectacles and gave her a wondering shout of welcome that brought her cousin Loretta to the door, where she stopped a moment, anchored with surprise. Over her shoulder peered her cousin Dave, and June saw his face darken while she looked. "Why, honey," said the old miller, "have you really come home again?" While Loretta simply said, "My Lord," and came out and stood with her hands on her hips looking at June. "Why, ye ain't a bit changed. I knowed ye wasn't goin' to put on no airs like Dave thar said." She turned on Dave, who, with a surly shrug, wheeled and went back into the store. Uncle Billy was going home. "Come down to see us right away now," he called back. "Ole Hon's might nigh crazy to git yer eyes on ye." "All right, Uncle Billy," said June. "Early tomorrer." The Red Fox did not open his lips, but his pale eyes searched the girl from head to foot. "Git down, June," said Loretta, "an' I'll walk up to the house with ye." June slid down. Devil Judd started the old horse, and as the two girls with their arms about each other's waists followed, the wolfish side of the Red Fox's face lifted in an ironical snarl. Bub was standing at the gate, and when he saw his father riding home alone, his wistful eyes filled and his cry of disappointment brought the step-mother to the door. "Whar's June?" he cried, and June heard him, and loosening herself from Loretta, she ran round the horse and had Bub in her arms. Then she looked up into the eyes of her step-mother. The old woman's face looked kind, so kind that for the first time in her life June did what her father could never get her to do. She called her Mammy, and then she gave that old woman the surprise of her life. She kissed her. Right away she must see everything, and Bub, in ecstasy, wanted to pilot her around to see the new calf and the new pigs and the new chickens, but dumbly June looked to a miracle that had come to pass to the left of the cabin. A flower garden, the like of which she had seen only in her dreams. End of chapter 16.
Of the Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 17. Twice her lips opened soundlessly, and dazed, she could only point dumbly. The old stepmother laughed. "Jack Hale done that. He pestered yo' pap to let him do it for ye, and anything Jack Hale wants from yo' pap he gets. I thought it was plumb foolishness, but he's got things to eat planted thar, too, and I declare it's right pretty." That wonderful garden! June started for it on a run. There was a broad grass walk down through the middle of it, and there were narrow grass walks running sideways, just as they did in the gardens which Hale told her he had seen in the outer world. The flowers were planted in raised beds, and all the ones that she had learned to know and love at the Gap were there, and many more besides, the hollyhocks, bachelor's buttons, and marigolds she had known all her life, the lilacs, touch-me-nots, tulips, and narcissus she had learned to know in gardens at the Gap. 2 rose bushes were in bloom, and there were strange grasses and plants and flowers that Jack would tell her about when he came. One side was sentineled with sunflowers, and another side by transplanted laurel and rhododendron shrubs, and hidden in the plant and flower-bordered squares were the vegetables that won her stepmother's tolerance of Hale's plan. Through and through June walked, her dark eyes flashing joyously here and there when they were not a little dimmed with tears, with Loretta following her, unsympathetic in appreciation, wondering that June should be making such a fuss about a lot of flowers, but envious withal when she half guessed the reason, and impatient Bud eager to show her other births and changes. And over all the while June was whispering to herself, "My garden, my garden." When she came back to the porch after a tour through all that was new or had changed, Dave had brought his horse and Loretta's to the gate. No, he wouldn't come in and rest a spell. "They must be getting along home," he said shortly, and old Judd Tolliver insisted that he should stay to dinner, and Dave tied the horses to the fence and walked to the porch, not lifting his eyes to June. Straightway the girl went into the house to help her stepmother with dinner, but the old woman told her she reckoned she needn't startin' yet, adding in a querulous tone June knows so well, "I've been mighty poorly, and there'll be a mighty lot for you to do now." So, with this direful prophecy in her ears, the girl hesitated. The old woman looked at her closely. "You ain't a bit changed," she said. They were the words Loretta had used, and in the voice of each was the same strange tone of disappointment. June wondered, were they sorry she had not come back, putting on airs and fussed up with ribbons and feathers, that they might hear her picked to pieces and perhaps do some of the picking themselves? Not Loretta, surely, but the old stepmother? June left the kitchen and sat down just inside the door. The Red Fox and 2 other men had sauntered up from the store, and all were listening to his quavering chat. "I seed a vision last night, and there's trouble a-comin' in these mountains. The Lord told me so straight from the clouds. These railroads and coal miners is a-goin' to raise taxes, so that a poor man will have to sell his hogs and his corn to pay 'em, and have nothin' left to keep him from starvin' to death. Them police fellers over there at the Gap is a-stirrin' up strife and a-runnin' things over there as though the earth was made for them, and the citizens ain't goin' to stand for it. And this war's a-comin', and on there'll be shootin' and killin' over there and over here. I seed all this devilment in a vision last night, as sure as I'm sittin' here." Old Judd grunted, shifted his huge shoulders, parted his mustache and beard with 2 fingers, and spat through them. "Well, I reckon you didn't see no devilment, Red, that you won't take a hand in, if it comes." The other men laughed, but the Red Fox looked meek and lowly. "I'm a servant of the Lord. He says do this, and I does it the best I know how. I goes about a-preachin' the word in the wilderness, and a-healin' the sick with soothin' yarbs and such." "And makin' compacts with the devil," said old Judd shortly, "when the eye of man is a-lookin' the other way." The left side of the Red Fox's face twitched in the faintest shadow of a snarl, but shaking his head, he kept still. "Well," said Sam Barth, who was thin and long and sandy, "I don't care what them fellers do on t'other side of the mountain, but what air they comin' over here for?" Old Judd spoke again. "Give you a job, if you wasn't too dern lazy to work." "Yeah," said the other man, who was dark, swarthy, and whose black eyebrows met across the bridge of his nose, "that damned Hale who's tearing up hell fire here in the Cove." The old man lifted his eyes. Young Dave's face wore a sudden malignant sympathy which made June clench her hands a little more tightly. "What about him? You must have been over to the Gap lately, like Dave there. Did you get bored in the calaboose?" It was a random thrust, but it was accurate, and it went home, and there was silence for a while. Presently old Judd went on. "Taxes hain't goin' to be raised, and if they are, folks will be better able to pay 'em. Them police fellers at the Gap don't bother nobody if he behaves himself. This war will start when it does start, and as for Hale, he's as square and as clever a fellow as I've ever seed. His word is just as good as his bond. I'm a-goin' to sell him this land. It'll be his'n, and he can do what he wants to do with it. I'm his friend, and I'm goin' to stay his friend as long as he goes on as he's goin' now, and I'm not goin' to see him bothered as long as he tends to his own business." The words fell slowly, and the weight of them rested heavily on all except on June. Her fingers loosened, and she smiled. The Red Fox rose, shaking his head. "All right, Judd Tolliver," he said warningly. "Come in and get something to eat, Red." "No," I said, "I'll be getting along." And he went, still shaking his head. The table was covered with an oilcloth spotted with drippings from a candle. The plates and cups were thick, and the spoons were of pewter. The bread was soggy, and the bacon was thick and floating in grease. The men ate, and the women served, as in ancient days. They gobbled their food like wolves, and when they drank their coffee, the noise they made was painful to June's ears. There were no napkins, and when her father pushed his chair back, he wiped his dripping mouth with the back of his sleeve. And Loretta and the stepmother, they too ate with their knives and used their fingers. Poor June quivered with a vague newborn disgust. Ah, had she not changed in ways they could not see? June helped clear away the dishes. The old woman did not object to that. Listening to the gossip of the mountains, courtships, marriages, births, deaths, the growing hostility in the feud, the random killing of this man or that, Hale's doings in Lonesome Cove. "He's comin' over here again next Saturday," said the old woman. "Is he?" said Loretta in a way that made June turn sharply from her dishes toward her. She knew Hale was not coming, but she said nothing. The old woman was lighting her pipe. "Yes, you better be over here in your best bib and tucker." "Pshaw!" said Loretta, but June saw 2 bright spots come into her pretty cheeks, and she herself burned inwardly. The old woman was looking at her.
"'Pears like you're mighty quiet, June."
"That's so," said Loretta, looking at her too. June, still silent, turned back to her dishes. They were beginning to take notice after all, for the girl hardly knew that she had not opened her lips. Once only Dave spoke to her, and that was when Loretta said she must go. June was out in the porch looking at the already beloved garden, and hearing his step she turned. He looked her steadily in the eyes. She saw his gaze drop to the fairy stone at her throat, and a faint sneer appeared at his set mouth, a sneer for June's folly and what he thought was uppishness in the furriners like Hale.
"So, you ain't good enough for him just as you are, here,"
he said slowly.
"He's got to make ye all over again, so you'll be fittin' for him."
He turned away without looking to see how deep his barbed shaft went, and, startled, June flushed to her hair. In a few minutes they were gone, Dave without the exchange of another word with June, and Loretta with a parting cry that she would come back on Saturday. The old man went to the cornfield high above the cabin. The old woman, groaning with pains real and fancied, lay down on a creaking bed, and June, with Dave's wound rankling, went out with Bub to see the new doings in Lonesome Cove. The geese cackled before her, the hogfish darted like submarine arrows from rock to rock, and the willows bent in the same wistful way toward their shadows in the little stream, but its crystal depths were there no longer. Floating sawdust whirled in eddies on the surface, and the water was black as soot. Here and there the white belly of a fish lay upturned to the sun, for the cruel, deadly work of civilization had already begun. Further up the creek was a buzzing monster that, creaking and snorting when a flashing disk, rimmed with sharp teeth, biting a savage way through a log, that screamed with pain as the brutal thing tore through its vitals, and gave up its life each time with a ghost-like cry of agony. Further on, little houses were being built of fresh boards, and further on the water of the creek got blacker still. June suddenly clutched Bud's arms. Two demons had appeared on a pile of fresh dirt above them, sooty, begrimed, with black faces, black hands, and in the cap of each was a smoking little lamp.
"Huh?" said Bub. "'Tain't nothin'." "Hello, Bill," he called bravely.
"Hello, Bub," answered one of the two demons, and both stared at the lovely little apparition who was staring with such naive horror at them. It was all very wonderful, though, and it was all happening in Lonesome Cove. But Jack Hale was doing it all, and therefore it was all right, thought June, no matter what. Dave said, moreover, the ugly spot on the great beautiful breast of the mother was such a little one after all, and June had no idea how it must spread. Above the opening for the mines the creek was crystal clear as ever. The great hills were the same, and the sky and the clouds and the cabin and the fields of corn. Nothing could happen to them. But if even they were wiped out by Hale's hand, she would have made no complaint. A wood thrush flitted from a ravine as she and Bub went back down the creek, and she stopped with uplifted face to listen. All her life she had loved its song, and this was the first time she had heard it in Lonesome Cove since she had learned its name from Hale. She had never heard it thereafter without thinking of him, and she thought of him now while it was breathing out the very spirit of the hills, and she drew a long sigh, for already she was lonely and hungering for him. The song ceased, and a long wavering cry came from the cabin. "Soo-cow, Soo-kee, Soo-kee." Old Mother was calling the cows. It was near milking time, and with a vague uneasiness she hurried Bub home. She saw her father coming down from the cornfield. She saw the two cows come from the woods into the path that led to the barn, switching their tails and snatching mouthfuls from the bushes as they swung down the hill, and when she reached the gate, her stepmother was standing on the porch with one hand on her hip and the other shading her eyes from the slanting sun, waiting for her. Already kindness and consideration were gone.
"Where you been, June? Hurry up now. You've had a long restin' spell while I've been a-workin' myself to death."
It was the old tone, and the old fierce rebellion rose within June. But Hale had told her to be patient. She could not check the flash from her eyes, but she shut her lips tight on the answer that sprang to them, and without a word she went to the kitchen for the milking pails. The cows had forgotten her. They eyed her with suspicion and were restive. The first one kicked at her when she put her beautiful head against its soft flank. Her muscles had been in disuse, and her hands were cramped, and her forearms ached before she was through, but she kept doggedly at her task. Then she finished. Her father had fed the horses and was standing behind her. "It's mighty good to have you back again, little gal." It was not often that he smiled or showed tenderness, much less spoke it thus openly, and June was doubly glad that she had held her tongue. Then she helped her stepmother get supper. The fire scorched her face that had grown unaccustomed to such heat, and she burned one hand, but she did not let her stepmother see even that. Again she noticed with aversion the heavy, thick dishes and the pewter spoons and the candle grease on the oilcloth. She put the dishes down, and while the old woman was out of the room, attacked the spots viciously. Again she saw her father and Bub ravenously gobbling their coarse food, while she and her stepmother served and waited, and she began to wonder. The woman sat at the table with the men over in the gap. Why not here? Then her father went silently to his pipe, and Bub to playing with the kitten at the kitchen door, while she and her mother ate, with never a word. Something began to stifle her, but she choked it down. There were the dishes to be cleared away and washed, and the pans and kettles to be cleaned. Her back ached, her arms were tired to the shoulders, and her burned hand quivered with pain when all was done. The old woman had let her do to the last few things alone, and had gone to her pipe. Both she and her father were sitting in silence on the porch when June went out there. Neither spoke to each other nor to her, and both seemed to be part of the awful stillness that engulfed the world. Bub fell asleep in the soft air, and June sat and sat and sat. That was all, except for the stars that came out over the mountains and were slowly being sprayed over the sky, and the pipings of frogs from the little creek. Once the wind came with a sudden sweep up the river, and she thought she could hear the creak of Uncle Billy's water wheel. It smote her with sudden gladness, not so much because it was a relief and because she loved the old miller, but such is the power of association, because she now loved the mill more, loved it because the mill over at the Gap had made her think more of the mill at the mouth of Lonesome Cove. A tapping vibrated through the railing on the porch on which her cheek lay. Her father was knocking the ashes from his pipe. A similar tapping sounded inside at the fireplace. The old woman had gone, and Bub was in bed, and she had heard neither move. The old man rose with a yawn. "Time to lay down, June." The girl rose. They all slept in one room. She did not dare to put on her nightgown. Her mother would see it in the morning. So she slipped off her dress, as she had done all her life, and crawled into bed with Bub, who laid in the middle of it, and who grunted peevishly when she pushed him with some difficulty over to his side. There were no sheets, not even one, and the coarse blankets, which had a close, acrid odor that she had never noticed before, seemed almost to scratch her flesh. She had hardly been to bed that early since she had left home, and she lay sleepless, watching the firelight play hide-and-seek with the shadows among the aged, smoky rafters and flicker over the strings of dried things that hung from the ceiling. In the other corner her father and stepmother snored heartily, and Bub, beside her, was in a nervous slumber that would not come to her that night, tired and aching as she was. So quietly, by and by, she slipped out of bed and out the door to the porch. The moon was rising. The radiant sheen of it had dropped down over the mountain-side like a golden veil, and was lighting up the white rising mist that trailed the curves of the river. It sank below the still crest of the pines beyond the garden and dropped on until it illuminated one by one the dewy heads of the flowers. She rose and walked down the grassy path in her bare feet, through the silent, fragrant emblems of the planter's thought of her, touching this flower and that with the tips of her fingers. And when she went back, she bent to kiss one lovely rose, and as she lifted her head with a start of fear, the dew from it shining on her lips made her red mouth as flower-like and no less beautiful. A yell had shattered the quiet of the world. Not the high fox-hunting yell of the mountains, but something new and strange. Up the creek were strange lights. A loud laugh shattered the succeeding stillness, a laugh she had never heard before in Lonesome Cove. Swiftly she ran back to the porch. Surely strange things were happening there. A strange spirit pervaded the cove, and the very air throbbed with premonitions. What was the matter with everything? What was the matter with her? She knew that she was lonely and that she wanted Hale, but what else was it? She shivered, and not alone from the chill night air, and puzzled and wondering and stricken at heart, she crept back to bed. End of chapter 17.